All right, so we're diving into the world of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz today, and you've brought some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of philosophy's entry on Leibniz on causation. And I have to say, this is going to be a fascinating deep dive.
Oh, yeah. Leibniz is, well, he's really something else when it comes to causation. I mean, his ideas are just so different from everything that came before him.
Yeah, from what I've read, he definitely wasn't afraid to shake things up a bit, philosophically speaking. So let's start with the basics. What was the philosophical landscape like when it came to theories of causation during Leibniz's time?
Well, he was engaging with some pretty big names and some really influential ideas. The main theories that were popular at the time were physical influx, occasionalism, and parallelism.
Okay, so three big contenders. Let's break them down one by one, starting with physical influx. What does that even mean?
So physical influx, well, imagine you're trying to explain how a thought causes your arm to move. This theory suggests that there's a literal transfer of some kind of property or force that jumps from your mind to your muscles.
Hmm. So it's like something is physically moving from one thing to another to cause an effect.
Yeah, exactly. Like a tiny little package being delivered from point A to point B. And Leibniz, well, he wasn't a fan of this idea for a couple of reasons.
I can see why that might raise some eyebrows.
Yeah.
It seems a little too magical almost.
Yeah, it's a bit messy, metaphysically speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And scientifically, it's problematic too. How can properties just detach themselves from one substance and attach to another? Plus, this whole idea seemed to violate the principle of the conservation of motion.
Right, which basically states that the total amount of motion in a closed system has to remain constant. So not a very elegant solution in Leibniz's view.
Not at all. So that's physical influx out of the window.
Yeah.
What about occasionalism then?
Okay, occasionalism. Bring it on.
All right, so occasionalism takes a very different approach. It basically says that God is the primary cause of every single event in the universe.
So God is like a cosmic puppeteer controlling every single action.
Exactly. And created substances are just puppets. They don't have any causal power of their own.
So no free will for team occasionalism then. We're all just following a divine script.
Pretty much. And that's one of the big reasons why Leibniz rejected it. He believed that God created a universe that could run on its own without needing constant intervention.
Right, a perfect self-sufficient system. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've ruled out physical influx and occasionalism. What about parallelism? What's the story there?
So parallelism tries to find a middle ground between those two extremes. It argues that substances don't directly influence each other, but they act in perfect synchronization, like two clocks set to the same time.
Interesting. So my mind and body, for example, aren't causally connected, but they're perfectly coordinated in their actions.
That's the idea. When you decide to reach for that cup of coffee, it's not your mind directly causing your arm to move. It's more like your mind and body are both pre-programmed to act in that way at the exact same time.
Okay, so it's all about pre-programming and synchronization. I'm starting to see where this is going because that sounds a bit like Leibniz's own theory of pre-established harmony.
You got it. That idea of pre-programming is definitely a key element, but the way Leibniz uses it is much more nuanced and sophisticated.
All right, so it seems like Leibniz wasn't satisfied with any of the existing explanations for causation. So what was his solution? How did he attempt to solve this philosophical puzzle?
Well, he did what any brilliant philosopher would do. He came up with his own completely unique theory. Leibniz's solution is called the pre-established harmony, and it proposes that every substance in the universe, every single one, which he calls monads, has its own internal blueprint, like a predetermined sequence of actions and perceptions.
So it's like each monad has its own script, its whole life story from beginning to end already written out?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And this is where the harmony part comes in.
Hmm.
It's not just a bunch of random monads doing their own thing. It's a symphony of perfectly coordinated actions, all orchestrated by God.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture, but this raises a question for me. If our monads are just following a script, what happens to free will? Are we really making our own choices?
Well, that's a question that's been debated for centuries. Leibniz argued that even though our actions are predetermined, we still act freely because we're following our own internal nature. Our choices are an expression of who we are, essentially.
So it's less about whether our actions are predetermined and more about whether they're authentic to our own internal programming.
Exactly. And this focus on the internal nature of substances is what led Leibniz to develop his unique perspective on causation.
Right, you mentioned earlier that Leibniz went beyond just efficient causation. He didn't just settle for the simple A caused B kind of explanation.
Exactly.
Hmm.
He recognized that just looking at the external interactions between things doesn't tell the whole story. He introduced the concepts of final causes and formal causes to paint a more complete picture.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me.
So imagine a sunflower turning towards the sun. In Leibniz's view, that's not just the simple reaction to an external stimulus. It's driven by the sunflower's own internal striving towards a goal, its inherent drive to flourish. That purpose, that striving for sunlight, is its final cause.
So the efficient cause is the actual physical process of the sunflower turning. But the final cause is the deeper underlying purpose behind that action.
Precisely. And then you have the formal cause, which is like the blueprint that guides the sunflower's growth and development. It's the inherent structure that makes a sunflower, as opposed to, say, a rose bush.
I see. So Leibniz is bringing together all these different levels of causation. It's like he's saying that to understand why something happens, we need to consider not just the external triggers, but also the internal purposes and the underlying structure of the thing itself.
Exactly. And that's where his concept of substance becomes really crucial. Leibniz believed that substances are the ultimate driving forces behind all change in the universe.
Okay, let's talk about substances then. What exactly did Leibniz mean by this term?
For Leibniz, a substance is like a mini-universe, a self-contained entity that possesses its own internal principles of activity and change. It's not dependent on anything outside of itself for its existence.
So we're not talking about physical objects in the usual sense, like a table or a chair. It's more like a center of force or energy that exists independently.
Precisely. And remember those monads we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
For Leibniz, monads are substances. They're the fundamental building blocks of reality, and everything else is built up from them.
So substances are these ultimate units of reality, constantly active and changing, each with its own internal program driving it forward.
And that internal program is driven by what Leibniz called primitive active force. It's like an internal engine that propels each substance through its predetermined sequence of actions and perceptions.
So it's not like substances are just passively reacting to external forces. They're actively generating their own changes from within, guided by this primitive active force. Like each substance has its own internal momentum.
That's a great way to put it. And it's a radical departure from a lot of other philosophies that saw substances as more static or inert.
Okay, I'm following you so far. But this raises another question. If each substance is like its own little world, how do they interact with each other? Do they even need to interact if they're already pre-programmed?
That's where we come back to the brilliance of pre-established harmony. Leibniz rejects the idea of substances directly influencing each other. Instead, their actions are perfectly synchronized from the very beginning, like a cosmic dance choreographed by God.
So there's no actual causal connection between substances. It's all about timing and predetermined coordination.
Exactly. It's like two musicians playing a duet. Their notes aren't causing each other to sound, but they harmonize perfectly because they're following the same score.
It's like a giant cosmic symphony, where every instrument is playing its part flawlessly, all thanks to the conductor's masterful arrangement.
Precisely. And this harmony isn't just limited to physical actions. It extends to our thoughts, our perceptions, even our relationships with each other.
Wait. So when I have a conversation with someone, it's not because their words are directly influencing my thoughts. It's because our monads were pre-programmed to have this perfectly synchronized exchange.
That's the mind-bending implication of pre-established harmony. It challenges our common sense understanding of how we interact with the world.
I don't know about you, but this is getting a little too deep for me. It's like we're venturing into the matrix here.
I can see why you'd say that.
Yeah.
But for Leibniz, this wasn't science fiction. It was a logical consequence of his philosophical system, and it led him to some pretty remarkable insights about the nature of reality and the role of God in the universe.
Okay, I'm ready to go even deeper down the rabbit hole. Let's talk about God then. Where does God fit into this elaborate system of pre-programmed harmony?
That's a great question, and it leads us to one of the most debated aspects of Leibniz's philosophy. Well, Leibniz was deeply religious, and he saw God's influence in everything, but he didn't believe that God was like a puppeteer constantly controlling every little thing.
Right, so it's not like occasionalism where God is the only cause of everything that happens.
Exactly. Leibniz completely rejected that idea. He believed that God created a world with true order and harmony, a world where substances could act according to their own internal principles, those pre-programmed blueprints we talked about.
Okay, so God created the system and set it in motion, but where does God's power actually come into play here? What's God doing if everything's already set to unfold in a specific way?
Well, Leibniz used the term concurrence to describe God's ongoing relationship with creation. It's kind of like God is a conductor guiding an orchestra, making sure every musician plays their part harmoniously, but allowing each one to express themselves within the overall composition.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So God is more like a subtle influence, a guiding hand rather than a direct cause of every single action.
Exactly. Think of it like this. Imagine you built a really complex clock and wound it up. That clock is going to run on its own, following the laws of mechanics that you so carefully designed. But you, the clockmaker, are still present in that clock's design and construction, even though you're not physically making the hands move.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So God set up the universe with these pre-established harmonies, and it's running according to plan. But God is still present in a way, making sure everything stays on track.
Precisely. God's power is constantly flowing through creation, sustaining those substances and maintaining that overall harmony.
This is all starting to sound incredibly elegant and well-ordered. But it makes me wonder, if God is all-powerful and has orchestrated everything so perfectly, why is there still so much suffering and evil in the world? It seems like there are some pretty big glitches in the system.
Well, that's a question that's been plaguing theologians and philosophers for ages. Leibniz tackled this head-on in his famous work, Theodicy.
Theodicy. Okay, I've heard of that.
Hmm.
But how did he explain the existence of evil in a world supposedly created by a perfect God?
Well, Leibniz argued that even though evil exists, this is still the best of all possible worlds.
The best of all possible worlds. Wow, that's a pretty bold claim. How could he possibly justify that with all the pain and suffering we see around us?
His argument was that God, being perfectly good and all-powerful, would naturally create the most perfect world possible. And while this world might not seem perfect to us with our limited human understanding, it's the most perfect in terms of the overall balance of good and evil, harmony and discord.
So it's like God had to solve a massive equation, taking into account every possible variable to come up with the best possible solution, even if that solution includes things that we find unpleasant or even downright evil.
Exactly. And Leibniz believed that even the things we perceive as evil can ultimately contribute to a greater good, even if we can't always see how.
It's a complex and challenging concept, but it does offer a different perspective on the problem of evil.
It definitely does. And it's just to show how ambitious Leibniz was in trying to create a philosophical system that could explain everything in the universe, from the tiniest monad to the biggest cosmic principles.
This deep dive has been incredible. We've covered causation, substance, God's role in the universe, and even the problem of evil. It's amazing how Leibniz's ideas tie all these different philosophical threads together.
And what's truly remarkable is how relevant his ideas still are today. Centuries later, we're still grappling with these fundamental questions about cause and effect, free will, the nature of reality, and God's place in it all. And Leibniz's work offers us some really valuable insights and fresh perspectives on these age-old puzzles.
So what can we and you, our listeners, take away from all of this? Well, I think Leibniz's philosophy really encourages us to look beyond the surface, to consider those deeper structures and purposes at work in the world around us.
And to quote Leibniz himself, he often said, "The present is pregnant with the future."
In other words, everything that exists right now contains within it the seeds of what's to come.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings us to a final thought-provoking question for you to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Leibniz. If the very essence of a substance is to act, are you living up to your full potential? How can you, like a Leibnizian substance, strive for greater harmony, clarity, and purpose in your own life and become a more active force for good in the world?